The shattering of a world. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, in the spring of 1941, was a powder keg awaiting a spark. For 15-year-old Lepa Radić, living in the village of Gasnica near Bosanska Gradiška, the world was one of schoolbooks, family, and the burgeoning political ideas whispered by her uncle, Lepa Radić, a dedicated communist. The archives of her school show a student of sharp intellect and deep empathy, a girl on the cusp of womanhood in a nation stitched together with fragile ethnic and political threads. That fragility was torn asunder on April 6, 1941. Operation 25, the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia, was a textbook demonstration of German blitzkrieg. Luftwaffe bombers struck Belgrade without a declaration of war, while panzer divisions sliced through the antiquated Royal Yugoslav Army. Within 11 days, the nation ceased to exist. Official German communiques, stored in reels of microfiche in our archives, speak of a swift, decisive victory. But on the ground, it was the beginning of a multi-layered nightmare. The country was carved up by Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. At the heart of this vivisection was the creation of the independent state of Croatia, NDH, a fascist puppet regime governed by the brutal Ustase. For the large Serbian population of Bosnia, like the Radić family, this was not merely a change of flags, it was a death sentence. The Ustase ideology, a toxic brew of clerical fascism and racial fanaticism, mandated the extermination of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The air in Gasnica, once filled with the sounds of a marketplace, soon filled with the metallic tang of fear. The world Lepa had known was gone, replaced by a landscape of terror where neighbors turned on neighbors and survival became a daily, desperate calculation. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The forging of a revolutionary. The initial response to the Ustase regime's campaign of genocide was one of shock and scattered, desperate flight. But resistance was in the DNA of the Radić family. The archival records of the League of Communist Youth of Yugoslavia, SKOJ, list Lepa Radić as an active member well before the invasion. SKOJ was not merely a youth club, it was a disciplined, clandestine network for political indoctrination and practical action. In the months following the occupation, under the tutelage of her uncle, Lepa's youthful idealism was hammered into a weapon. We have partisan testimonies describing her first acts of resistance, distributing anti-fascist leaflets printed on hidden presses, gathering intelligence on Ustase and German troop movements, and helping to organize escape routes for targeted families. These were not the actions of a child, but of a seasoned operative in training. The human factor analysis here is critical. What drives a 15-year-old to undertake activities punishable by immediate execution? It was the visceral reality of the Ustase terror. Her biography is intertwined with the massacres at the Jasenovac concentration camp, a place of indescribable horror within the NDH. Every story of a murdered family, every roundup of Serbs, every decree stripping them of their rights, was a blow that hardened her resolve. In November 1941, the inevitable hammer fell. The Ustase arrested her entire family, including her father Svetozar, her uncles Vladeta and Voja, and her younger brother Milan. Through the help of a sympathetic insider, Lepa and her sister Dara, aged 13, managed to escape the prison. 2 weeks later, their father and uncles were executed. The girl who had read pamphlets was now an orphan of the regime, a fugitive with nothing left to lose. The path to the forest, to the partisans, was now the only one left. From the shadows to the forest. Escaping into the forested wilderness of the Kozara Mountains in December 1941 marked Lepa's final transition from clandestine urban activist to guerrilla fighter. The material reality of joining Tito's partisans was a brutal shock, a fact meticulously detailed in the diaries of partisan fighters. There were no barracks, no reliable supply lines, no standard-issue uniforms. A fighter was defined by their weapon, almost always captured or scavenged. A German soldier of the 718th Infantry Division, stationed in Bosnia at the time, would have been equipped with a Mauser Kar 98K rifle, stick grenades, a steel helmet, and sturdy leather boots, backed by a logistical chain stretching to Germany. In stark contrast, a photograph from a captured partisan unit in this period shows a group of young men and women in civilian clothes, some wearing traditional peasant or pantsy shoes, holding a motley collection of Italian Carcano rifles, old Yugoslav Mausers, and the occasional prized German MP-40 submachine gun. Food was a constant obsession. The economic context of occupied Yugoslavia was one of systematic plunder. The German war machine requisitioned everything, leaving the local population on the brink of starvation. For the partisans, this meant relying on the generosity of sympathetic villagers, a generosity often punished by the Germans with the burning of entire villages. Lepa Radić, now 16, stepped into this world of perpetual hunger, cold, and existential threat. She was assigned to the 2nd Krajina Detachment, a unit operating in the highly contested territory of northwestern Bosnia, a landscape that became both their fortress and their prison. A healer in the crossfire. Lepa was not initially assigned a combat role in the traditional sense. Her youth, empathy, and intelligence made her a perfect candidate for two of the most vital roles in any partisan unit, a balnikarka, medic, and a youth political leader. Analyzing the tactical structure of partisan warfare reveals the overwhelming importance of the medical corps. In a conventional army, a wounded soldier is evacuated to a rear area hospital. For the partisans, the rear area was wherever the enemy wasn't at that precise moment. There were no sterile operating theaters, no penicillin, no blood plasma. A recovered archival document, a field manual for partisan medics, details procedures for amputating limbs with a wood saw and sterilizing instruments in boiling water over a campfire. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. Every fighter saved was a crucial preservation of combat strength. Lepa threw herself into this work, tending to wounds inflicted by German MG-42 machine guns, shrapnel from 81mm mortars, and the ever-present threat of frostbite and typhus. Her biography from this period, pieced together from survivor accounts, paints a picture of a girl who combined fierce ideological conviction with profound compassion. While her hands were binding wounds, her voice was a tool to maintain morale, especially among the youngest recruits. She organized youth committees, taught illiterate fighters to read and write using communist political tracts as primers, and embodied the party's promise of a new, egalitarian Yugoslavia free from the ethnic hatreds that had torn the country apart. She was fighting the war on two fronts, against the physical wounds of battle and the psychological wounds of despair. The gathering storm, Unternehmen Weiss. By late 1942, the partisan movement had evolved from scattered bands of rebels into a formidable guerrilla army, controlling large swaths of territory dubbed Tito's state. This success was an intolerable thorn in the side of the Axis High Command. My archives contain the original German operational order for Unternehmen Weiss, Case White, dated January 1943. The plan was strategically ambitious and utterly ruthless, to encircle and annihilate the partisan main operational group, along with its central command and a wandering hospital of over 4,000 wounded fighters in the mountains of western Bosnia. The forces arrayed against them were overwhelming. German operational maps show a pincer movement of immense scale, involving 4 German divisions, including the elite 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen, infamous for its brutality, 3 Italian divisions, and 2 Croatian Ustase divisions, a combined force of over 90,000 troops, supported by armor and the Luftwaffe. Against this, Tito had perhaps 20,000 fighters, burdened by thousands of typhus-stricken wounded and terrified civilians. The Battle of the Neretva had begun. Lepa Radić, now serving with the 7th Krajina Brigade, found herself and her unit caught squarely within this closing dragnet. Her role had shifted from medic to organizer, tasked with a mission of mercy and survival, escorting a large group of wounded and civilians away from the main German advance, seeking a path through the tightening ring of steel. The bitter Balkan winter of 1943 was the backdrop for this desperate flight. The snow was deep, food was non-existent, and the sky was filled with the drone of German reconnaissance planes. The hunt was on. The long march into the cauldron. The retreat through the Grmek Mountains in late January 1943 was a descent into a frozen hell. My archives contain weather reports from Luftwaffe meteorological stations in the area, noting temperatures plummeting to -20 degrees Celsius, with heavy snowfall and biting winds. For the German ski troops of the 7th SS Division, this was challenging terrain. For the partisans and the column of civilians and wounded Lepa Radić was helping to guide, it was a death march. This was the brutal logistical reality of partisan warfare. Every wounded fighter was a living anchor, slowing the column, consuming precious food, and requiring able-bodied fighters to act as stretcher-bearers. Lepa, barely 17 but already a veteran of this kind of hardship, moved tirelessly along the straggling line. Survivor testimonies paint a consistent picture: a small figure in patched clothes, her face raw from the wind, encouraging those who fell, redistributing the last handfuls of boiled wheat, and checking the filthy bandages on festering wounds. Her biography during these days is not one of dramatic combat, but of a desperate, grinding battle against nature and despair. The constant threat came from the sky. The distinctive drone of a Fiesler Storch reconnaissance plane would send the entire column scrambling for the cover of pine trees, followed by the terror of a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka attack. The wail of its Jericho trumpet siren, a deliberate psychological weapon, was the herald of bombs and strafing runs that left craters and bodies in the snow. Lepa's role was part shepherd, part political officer, part big sister to the terrified children, telling them stories of a future without Germans and Ustes, a future she was fighting to build, even as the present was collapsing around them. The nature of the enemy. To understand Lepa's fate, one must analyze the specific units tasked with her destruction. This was not a clash of conventional armies adhering to the Geneva Convention. The German force tightening the noose was the 369th, Croatian, Reinforced Infantry Division, known as the Devil's Division. Formed from Croatian volunteers and commanded by German officers, it combined Wehrmacht efficiency with a local, ideological ferocity against the predominantly Serbian partisans. Declassified Wehrmacht directives on Bandenbekämpfung, bandit fighting, from this period are chillingly clear. The enemy was not a soldier but a bandit, and the rules of engagement were suspended. Captured partisans, especially political officers or medics, were to be interrogated immediately and executed. Villages suspected of aiding them were to be razed. Alongside the 369th was the notorious 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen. Comprised of ethnic German Volksdeutsch from Yugoslavia and Romania, their fanaticism and brutality were legendary. Archival combat logs from this division detailed cleansing operations that were, in reality, massacres of civilians. This doctrine of absolute terror was a calculated strategic choice. By making the cost of supporting the partisans unthinkably high, the Germans aimed to isolate them from the populace, their source of food, shelter, and recruits. For Lepa and the people in her care, this meant there was no possibility of surrender. Capture did not mean becoming a prisoner of war, it meant torture, interrogation, and a brutal death. This knowledge permeated the partisan ranks, creating a mindset where fighting to the last bullet was not just an ideological slogan, but a tactical necessity for survival. The engagement at Grmek. In early February 1943, near the village of Prasteli in the foothills of the Grmek Mountains, the German dragnet finally closed. The vanguard of the 369th Division, guided by aerial reconnaissance, ambushed Lepa's column. The engagement, as pieced together from German after-action reports and the scant few partisan survivors, was a brutal, one-sided affair. The German tactical approach was devastatingly effective. Machine gun teams, armed with the MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw, set up interlocking fields of fire from elevated positions, pouring thousands of rounds per minute into the exposed column. Mortar teams methodically walked their shells up and down the partisan lines, the explosions sending shrapnel and frozen earth flying. The partisans, possessing only rifles and a few light machine guns, were pinned down, their primary objective shifting in an instant from escape to a desperate, last-ditch defense of the wounded. In the chaos, Lepa Radić's role transformed. She was no longer just a medic. Partisan accounts state that as the line began to break, she picked up a rifle from a fallen comrade and began organizing a defense. Other accounts, including those later used by the Germans, specify she was firing a pistol, attempting to rally the few remaining fighters to cover the retreat of the non-combatants. This was the crucible moment. Faced with overwhelming firepower and the collapse of her unit, the human factor of her training and ideology came to the fore. She chose to fight. She expended every round she had, not in a suicidal charge, but in a calculated effort to buy seconds for the people she had sworn to protect. It was a futile but magnificent act of defiance against the inevitable. The moment of capture. The world shrank to the snow-covered ground in front of her, the air thick with the smell of cordite and the screams of the dying. The disciplined, rhythmic firing of the German machine guns tore the partisan defense to shreds. Reconstructing these moments relies on fragmented after-action reports and the painful testimony of the few civilians who survived by hiding under the bodies of the dead. The soldiers of the 369th Division advanced methodically, their white winter camouflage making them appear like ghosts against the snow. Lepa was among the last to be overrun. Her pistol was empty. German military records, though sparse on the details of individual captures, often noted the capture of Flintenweber, gunwomen, with a mixture of contempt and grudging acknowledgement of their ferocity. She was 17 years old, exhausted, half-frozen, and had just witnessed the slaughter of her comrades and the people in her charge. The soldiers who captured her were not the ideological fanatics of the SS, but regular infantrymen of the Wehrmacht-trained Croatian division, men who were simply executing their orders. They found a teenage girl, her face smudged with gunpowder, her eyes blazing with a defiance that no amount of firepower could extinguish. She did not plead. She did not cry. According to local legend, later corroborated by witnesses, she continued to shout encouragement to any who might still be able to escape, and curses at her captors. The girl who had once hidden pamphlets in her schoolbooks was now a captured enemy combatant, her life measured in the hours it would take for her captors to decide her fate. Interrogation and imprisonment. Lepa Radić was not taken to a formal POW camp. That was a luxury afforded to soldiers of recognized armies, not bandits. She was taken to a makeshift German command post in the recently captured town of Bosanska Krupa. The building, likely a commandeered school or municipal office, now served as a hub for interrogation and processing captives. To her captors from the 369th Division, she was not a child but a valuable intelligence asset. As a known youth leader and activist within her unit, they believed she held key information, the names of other communist organizers in the villages, the locations of supply caches, and the intended escape routes of other partisan groups. The German strategy of Bandenbekämpfung relied heavily on such tactical intelligence to dismantle the partisan support network. The interrogation began almost immediately. The methods employed, while not detailed in official logs, are well documented in thousands of similar cases, a combination of psychological pressure, threats, and physical brutality. They offered her a simple, terrible bargain, a bargain offered to countless captured partisans. Her life in exchange for the names of her comrades in the Grmek region and the members of the local underground network. For her captors, this was a standard procedure. For Lepa, it was the ultimate test of her entire existence. Everything she had learned, every principle she had fought for, everything she had lost, converged on this single choice. Her silence was her final weapon. We can analyze this moment from a biographical perspective. Her family had been executed by the Ustes, her comrades had just been slaughtered. Betrayal of the cause for which they had died was, for her, a fate worse than death. Her refusal was absolute. Frustrated, her German and Croatian captors made their decision. She was deemed incorrigible, a political fanatic. The sentence was death by hanging. It was to be a public spectacle, a warning to the rest of the population. They transferred her to a crude holding cell to await her execution. The girl from Gasnica had only days, perhaps hours, left to live. The theater of terror. The decision to execute Lepa Radić by public hanging was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a core tenet of German anti-partisan doctrine. My archives are replete with German military directives emphasizing the need to exempel statuieren, to make an example. In the context of Unternehmen Weiss, with partisan forces still active and the local population's allegiance uncertain, her execution was intended as a brutal piece of theater. The location, Bosanska Krupa, was chosen for its strategic value as a local hub. The audience would not just be the soldiers of the 369th Division, but the town's civilian population, who would be forced to witness the event. The analysis of this strategy is revealing. The Germans understood that controlling territory was less important than controlling the will of the people. Fear was a more effective weapon than a bullet. A secret execution would have eliminated one fighter. A public execution was designed to terrorize thousands into submission. The choice of victim, a teenage girl, was particularly deliberate. It was meant to demonstrate that no one was exempt from the Reich's wrath, not women, not the young, not the ideologically committed. It was a message that resistance in any form would lead to the ultimate degradation, a public and shameful death. The choice of method, hanging, was also significant. In military tradition, a firing squad was often seen as a soldier's death. Hanging was reserved for criminals, spies, and bandits. By hanging her, they were making a final, posthumous statement about her status, denying her any honor in death. The preparations were grimly efficient, a small but important logistical task in the midst of a major military operation. The final morning. February 11, 1943. The air was crystalline with a cold that seeped through stone and bone. From the window of her crude cell, Lepa Radić would have heard the sounds of an occupied town waking under military rule, the rumble of German truck engines, the sharp commands of officers, the muted shuffling of civilians navigating the streets under the gaze of armed sentries. There are no diaries or final letters from Lepa. Her state of mind must be inferred from her actions, a biographical analysis based on the testimony of those who saw her in her final hours. Witnesses described her as calm, composed, almost unnervingly serene. The psychological fortitude required for this is immense. At 17, facing a lonely and terrifying death, her ideological training and personal conviction had formed an impenetrable shield around her spirit. When the guards came for her, she did not struggle. They bound her hands behind her back and led her out into the biting morning air. The walk through the streets of Bosanska Krupa was part of the punishment. It was a procession designed for humiliation, allowing the townspeople to see the captured bandit. But according to eyewitness accounts passed down through generations, the effect was the opposite. They saw not a criminal, but a young girl from their own land, walking with her head held high, her gaze fixed forward. She was thin, her clothes were tattered, and her face bore the marks of exhaustion and interrogation, but her spirit was visibly, tangibly unbroken. For the German officers observing, this must have been a frustrating paradox. The more they sought to break her, the stronger she appeared. Her silent defiance on that final walk was her first act in the day's terrible theater. The makeshift gallows. The place of execution was not a formal square but an open area near a prominent bagrim, or black locust tree. There was no elaborate scaffold. The gallows was the tree itself, a sturdy branch selected for its height and strength. Beneath it, a simple wooden box or stool was placed. This crude setup speaks volumes about the nature of the occupation. This wasn't the formalized, bureaucratic killing of the concentration camps. This was frontier justice, dispensed swiftly and brutally by an army in the field. A perimeter had been established by soldiers of the 369th Division. We can visualize the scene through the lens of archival photographs of similar events. The soldiers, clad in their winter-issue greatcoats and steel helmets, holding their carabine and 98K rifles, formed a grim cordon. They were not SS fanatics but regular soldiers, their faces impassive, perhaps numb to the grim duties of occupation. A group of German officers stood apart, observing the proceedings with clinical detachment. The most important element of the scene, however, was the crowd of forcibly assembled Yugoslav civilians. Their presence was mandatory. German tactical doctrine dictated that the cleansing of a partisan-infested area required the intimidation of the populace. They were there to learn a lesson. Their faces, a mixture of fear, sorrow, and simmering rage, would have formed a silent, powerless chorus to the drama about to unfold. For Lepa, standing before the tree, this crowd was not a source of shame, but her final audience, the people for whom she was about to die. She was not just a victim, she was the central actor in a final, defiant performance. The final offer. With the noose already hanging from the branch and the crowd held in a terrified silence, the German commander made one final attempt to extract intelligence. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated drama. An officer, likely through a Croatian translator, stepped forward and addressed Lepa directly, his voice loud enough for the assembled crowd to hear. The bargain was repeated, one last time, they're on the precipice of death. The archival and testimonial records are consistent on this point. If you tell us the names of your comrades and leaders, the offer came, we will spare your life. It was the ultimate temptation, survival. A return to the world of the living, to sunlight, to the possibility of a future. For a 17-year-old, the biological imperative to live must have been immense. It was the moment where her entire identity was to be either affirmed or shattered. She looked not at the officer, but out at the crowd, at her people. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, without a tremor. Her words have been seared into the memory of a nation. I am not a traitor to my people, she declared. Then, she delivered a prophecy and a curse in one breath. Those you ask about will reveal themselves when they have succeeded in wiping out all you evildoers, to the last man. In that single sentence, she rejected their offer, affirmed her loyalty, condemned her executioners, and promised their ultimate defeat. She had seized control of the theater of terror and turned it into a stage for her own immortality. The German officers were stunned. The crowd was electrified with a dangerous mixture of awe and grief. She had won. The click of the shutter. Her final words hung in the frozen air, an act of defiance that could not be retracted. There was nothing left to do but complete the sentence. The soldiers moved to place the rough rope noose around her neck. Even in this final moment, she resisted, straining against the rope, a last physical assertion of her will. It took several soldiers to force the noose over her head and tighten it. Then, the wooden box was kicked out from under her feet. Lepa Radić was dead. But in that instant, another act occurred, one that her executioners could never have anticipated would be their undoing in the annals of history. A German soldier raised a camera and captured the image. My archival analysis identifies the camera as likely a Leica or a Kanta, high-quality 35mm cameras favored by German soldiers for their portability and sharp optics. The soldier who took the famous photographs was not an official propagandist but a common NCO. The photographs show Lepa moments before death, the noose being adjusted, and in the most haunting image, her body hanging from the tree, her head tilted, a slight smile seemingly gracing her lips in death. An expression of peace or ultimate victory. Why was this picture taken? Perhaps as a grim souvenir, proof of a bandit eliminated. Perhaps to document the efficiency of the Bandenbekämpfung. Regardless of the motive, the act was a catastrophic miscalculation. The photograph, meant to be a private record of a German victory, would eventually be liberated from a dead or captured soldier's belongings. It ensured that Lepa Radić would not be a forgotten statistic. The click of that camera's shutter transformed her from a victim into an icon. It guaranteed that her final, defiant words would not be lost to history but would echo forever, amplified by the silent, irrefutable testimony of the photograph itself. The technology meant to document her demise instead ensured her immortality. The aftermath, ripples of defiance. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, the German and Croatian soldiers likely believed they had achieved their objective. A partisan bandit was eliminated, and the local populace had been given a stark and brutal lesson. A German after-action report for that day would have noted the successful pacification of the area and the execution of a captured political operative. But my analysis of partisan communications and post-war Yugoslav historiography reveals a vastly different outcome. The story of the girl on the gallows did not spread as a tale of terror, but as a legend of martyrdom. Partisan couriers, slipping through the forests and mountains, carried the news from one unit to another. The story was not just told, it was weaponized. Political commissars in every brigade used the tale of Lepa Radić as the centerpiece of their indoctrination sessions. They contrasted her unwavering loyalty with the brutality of the occupiers. Her final words, "Those you ask about will reveal themselves when they have succeeded in wiping out all you evildoers," became a rallying cry, a promise that every fighter was now obligated to fulfill. The biographical impact was immense. For thousands of other young women and men in the partisan ranks, Lepa became a symbol of what they were fighting for. She was not an abstract hero of the state, but one of them, a girl from a small village who had faced the ultimate test and had not faltered. This narrative transformed a tactical defeat, the capture and death of a fighter, into a massive strategic victory for partisan morale. The Germans had intended to sow fear; instead, they had planted a dragon's tooth of inspiration. The photograph is historical document. The photographs taken at the execution of Lepa Radić are among the most powerful and disturbing images of World War II. Let us analyze them not as mere pictures, but as primary archival documents. The technical quality is sharp, suggesting a good lens and a steady hand. The composition is unflinching. The images capture the sequence of events, the moments before, the adjustment of the noose, the final act. Most importantly, they document the human element with chilling clarity. We see the faces of the German soldiers, not monstrous caricatures, but ordinary-looking men performing an extraordinary act of brutality. This banality is, in itself, terrifying. We see Lepa's face, her expression shifting from defiance to a final, serene stillness. The photograph of her hanging body, which would become the most famous, is a masterpiece of unintentional symbolism. The stark contrast between the lifeless form and the living tree, the juxtaposition of her youthful body against the grim military greatcoats of her executioners, it encapsulates the entire struggle. When these photographs were eventually recovered, likely from the body of a German soldier killed later in the war, they became irrefutable evidence. They moved the story from the realm of oral legend to documented fact. Unlike a written report, which can be dismissed as propaganda, the photograph's visceral reality is undeniable. It forces the viewer to be a witness. The technology of the camera, a tool often used for German propaganda showing smiling, victorious soldiers, was here subverted to immortalize their own war crime and the heroism of their victim. A nation's hero, post-war legacy. After the war, the new Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, under Josip Broz Tito, began the immense task of nation-building. A crucial part of this project was the creation of a national mythology centered on the partisan struggle, known as the National Liberation War. This narrative was designed to unify a country of diverse ethnicities and religions under a shared story of sacrifice and victory against fascism. Within this pantheon of heroes, Lepa Radić was given a place of supreme honor. On December 20, 1951, at the young age of 25, had she lived, she was posthumously awarded the Order of the People's Hero, Yugoslavia's highest military decoration. Schools, streets, and youth pioneer brigades were named after her. Her story was taught to every child. This is a critical aspect of her legacy, the transition from a real person to a state-sanctioned symbol. The economic and political context of post-war Yugoslavia required such symbols. The state needed to justify its one-party rule and socialist agenda by constantly referencing the legitimacy won during the war. Lepa's story was perfect for this. She was young, female, a Serb from Bosnia, promoting inter-ethnic unity, a committed communist, and an undisputed martyr. However, this official sanctification also had the effect of somewhat distancing the real girl from the legend. The messy, terrifying details were often smoothed over to create a cleaner, more ideological icon. The focus was on her unwavering communism rather than the deeply personal motivations born from the slaughter of her family. The unraveling and the enduring symbol. The country that Lepa Radić died for, the one she believed would be a haven of brotherhood and unity, no longer exists. The collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s was a brutal and tragic undoing of the partisan promise. The very ethnic hatreds that Lepa had fought against roared back to life, tearing apart the nation in a series of bloody wars. The town of Bosanska Krupa, the site of her execution, once again saw bitter fighting, this time between Serbs, Croats, and Bosniak Muslims. In this new political context, the heroes of the partisan era were reevaluated. For ultranationalists on all sides, the communist, pan-Yugoslav ideals that Lepa represented were suddenly problematic, even contemptible. Monuments to partisan heroes were neglected, defaced, or destroyed. The street names were changed. It was a second death, an attempt to erase her from the landscape she had died to liberate. Yet, the symbol of Lepa Radić proved more resilient than the state that created her. In the 21st century, with the rise of the Internet and a renewed global interest in anti-fascist history, her story and, most importantly, her photograph, found a new, international audience. She was rediscovered not as a Yugoslav communist icon, but as a universal symbol of youthful courage against tyranny. Anti-fascist groups, feminists, and human rights advocates worldwide adopted her image. The photograph, once a German soldier's private souvenir, now belongs to the world, its power undiminished by the shifting political tides of the Balkans. Comprehensive analysis and conclusion. The story of Lepa Radić is a microcosm of the Second World War's brutal complexity. It is a narrative that weaves together multiple threads of historical analysis. Tactically, it demonstrates the brutal asymmetry of partisan warfare, where courage and knowledge of the terrain are pitted against overwhelming industrial firepower. Her last stand was a textbook example of a futile but necessary delaying action to save noncombatants. Technologically, the story is bookended by instruments of death and memory, the German MG-42 machine gun that slaughtered her column and the Leica camera that immortalized her Defiance. It is a profound lesson in how technology's impact is determined by its user and its context. From a biographical and human factor perspective, Lepa's journey from schoolgirl to revolutionary martyr in less than 2 years illustrates the radicalizing effect of occupation and genocide. Her unwavering resolve during interrogation was not born of abstract ideology alone, but of profound personal loss. Economically and logistically, her story is grounded in the perpetual partisan struggle for food, medicine, and ammunition, a reality that shaped every strategic decision. Finally, her legacy reveals the power and mutability of historical memory. She was a real girl, then a partisan legend, then a state-sponsored hero, then a discarded relic of a failed state, and finally, a global anti-fascist icon. Her executioners sought to make her an example of terror, but through her own indomitable will and the accidental testimony of a photograph, she became an eternal example of courage. The file on Lepa Radić does not close with her death on that frozen morning in 1943. It remains open, a testament to the fact that while you can kill a person, you cannot kill an idea when it is embodied by such profound and selfless sacrifice. Her voice, shouting defiance from the gallows, still echoes in the archives of history.